In this video, I want to explore the distinctions between a weak and a stable position. A weak position, and we're going to use a baseline of gravity or ground. So we've got the ground right here. And we have a weak position here because there's not much holding it up. There's one connection point with data or with ground or with reality. And a weak position, for example, is a lie that has no other connection to reality other than the lie itself. And so you've just got a verbal heuristic that's heading here, but all of the other data, for example, if you check out the timeline of the lie, the timing is off. If you check out the motivation for the lie, the motivation is off. So it's a very tenuous connection with reality. And so it's a collapsible position. Just a little bit of digging and it falls apart. A strong position, by contrast, is a position that has multiple reinforced connections with data and reality, and on multiple dimensions. So, for example, a position that correlates and strengthens mentally, emotionally, and physically is stronger than a mental position that doesn't feel good, or a feel-good position that doesn't make any sense, or something that sounds good, feels good, but doesn't actually work in an embodied form. A prototype that is great on paper, but when you actually flip the switch, the motor doesn't start turning. So you have dimensions. And some of the important dimensions in a strong position are time. So a position that is stable in past, present, and future is a stronger position than a position in the present that collapses in the past or collapses in the future. We already talked about the heart, mind, body dimensions. When you look at other distinctions such as financial, ecological, scientific, each of these are examples of dimensions, and a strong position gets stronger as solid dimensions interact with it. So, for example, if we take this angle right here, if we take this shape right here, and we'll get rid of this weak position, and we direct wind here, this triangle actually gets stronger because it's pressed down to the ground with the force of the wind going over it. It actually anchors stronger. And so when you have a strong position, the more engagement that position has with reality and with data, the stronger the position becomes. When you have a weak position, the more engagement you have with reality, with energy, the weaker the position becomes. And so one of the principles of good design is to engage intimately and deeply with reality. And in order to engage deeply and intimately with reality and survive, one must have positions that are reinforced with engagements with reality. Now, one of the difficult things here comes in comes with a divergent reality, meaning when you have a disintegrated reality, let's say you have a plane of reality up here, and you have a plane of reality here. Well, the thing that grounds you and integrates you with this reality, with this plane of reality, disintegrates you with this plane of reality up here. And so when we take up a position, one of the important things to look at is in reference to what. And one of the biggest splits that we have in a disintegrated reality is the split between science and culture. And there's a really important reason for that. And because what we're looking at a deeper level is the split between data, mathematics, environment, and the map of data, the map of the world created heuristically for human consciousness. So a culture that says, for example, that bigger is better is a map of reality. And it'll point to things like, health is good, so more health is better. Or, a little car is good, so a bigger car is better. A little house is good, so a bigger house is better. Some money is good, so more money is better. And it'll point at things that within a self-referential framework seem to make sense. And so it becomes a simplistic heuristic for interacting with reality. Bigger is better, more is better, or knowledge is power, or whatever it is that is created by the culture, is a model of reality that by its very nature is partial. In part because cultures, there have been 10,000 cultures in human history, cultures respond to environment. And so, for example, if you have a culture in a cold, snowy climate, meaning let's create a plane up here for a culture in a cold, snowy climate. And so this culture up here has a cycle. And within this part of the cycle, it's warm and sunny. And within this part of the culture, there's 3 feet of snow. Now, the defining point in this cultural cycle, or the defining point in the environmental cycle, is the 3 feet of snow as far as the human body is concerned. And so as the weather goes through this, 6 months of warm and 6 months of snow, the defining element is the intersection between environment and physiological survival. Because if everyone dies, because the human body is not designed for 3 feet of snow, if everyone dies in the culture, there is no culture. And so there is no sustainable culture. The definition of a sustainable culture means that it resides within living bodies. So for there to be a sustainable culture, it's got to define itself around the most fragile intersection with survival. And it's got to do that better than other cultures. So you have warm, you have snow, and you have, let's say, a couple of cultural options. One is go where the wind blows you. Well, if you go where the wind blows you, during the summer months of the culture, it's going to be great. You're going to be happier than the people worrying about the future. You're going to spend less energy. So you're going to thrive. You're going to enjoy life in this domain of the environment. However, when the first snow falls, there's going to be no food in storage. There's going to be no winter jackets. There's going to be no log cabin. There's going to be no fire. There's going to be no fireplace. There's going to be no cords of wood. Because the transition from warm to snow is rapid. And when it starts snowing and you're cold, etc., you can't grow food. You can't prepare food. Maybe the snow is too thick to build a house. Maybe you freeze to death on day one of the house, etc., because it wasn't finished before the evening came. And so you pass out. Now, another cultural environment says, okay, notice the summer, but prepare for the winter. Now, the pattern of preparation that gets you through the winter, maybe one prepares a little, and they get from this point in the cycle, and they live all the way up to halfway, but they don't have enough food. And so they starve. Maybe one gets to here. It's the culture that makes it back to the warm pattern. And a culture is simply a pattern of thinking, feeling, valuing, and behaving. That's what a culture is. It is a pattern. And while cultures evolve and compete in response to environment, once they form, they become self-referential. And so the culture that makes it through this, by definition, becomes the dominant culture. And the one that makes it through the best becomes the dominant of the dominant culture. But if the primary survival point is future think and anxiety, because let's say these people have no anxiety and no future think, but the people that make it through, their biggest differential is anxiety and future think. So that when it's nice in spring and summer, they're anxious about the next part of the cycle. And they're thinking about it. And so they spend this whole time preparing for this whole time. And then they learn that that creates survival, that creates success. And as a result, they deepen the groove. They deepen the neuronal program that says, be anxious, think about the future. Be anxious, think about the future. And so in that process, their survival increases in other areas. Now, over time, this self-referential meme, because first of all, it's a successful meme. Be anxious, think about the future. And so, you build a better house, you then improve the house, you then insulate the house, you then get a wood fireplace, then you get an oil furnace, then you get medical emergencies, first aid kits. You keep being anxious and you keep thinking about the future, and that whole bent of responsiveness grows and grows and grows and grows. And it keeps bringing you out on top because your neighbors didn't have a first aid kit, and so they lost one of their family members. And there was an extra long winter, and people didn't have the insulation and they ran out of firewood, and they had a problem there. And then so-and-so didn't save enough money and they didn't pay the mortgage. And other people start falling off, but the anxious response keeps paying off. So it gets deeper and deeper. But this is where that narrow point of survival that becomes the defining point in the cult, which then gets developed in reference to reality, ultimately becomes imprisoning, because once it gets self-referential, meaning where you start defining the entire world and one's entire identity and one's entire value hierarchy on how anxious you are and how much you think about the future and prepare for it with hard work and da-da-da. Once you do that, then you become more and more asymmetrical, because now you're in your lovely palace, you're this and that, and someone says, let's have a good time. It's like, no, I can't have a good time. I got to worry about maybe I'll lose my palace. Maybe there'll be an airstrike from who knows what. I've got to build a big wall around my palace because then there's all these poor people. Now I've got to do this. And it just keeps going because it's now self-referential. It's no longer looking at the environment in the broadest context from the spectrum of all values being equal. It's now become self-referential. And so you have things like working hard. Well, at some point when you've worked hard and it would make sense to take some time off, the working hard ethic is not about creating well-being. It's about working hard so that you can work hard, because working hard is good, so you should work hard because that's what's good. It becomes self-referential. And that's when the inefficiencies start to emerge. And that's when a culture that is a living culture starts to stultify into a dogma, into that's an up-and-coming person because they embody the cult irrespective of the actual relationship with the environment. So if you think about one's relationship with reality, one must assume a position. And this is where martial arts and yoga and various training comes in. Because some, like if you're doing a headstand, you can just be knocked over very easily. But if you're taking a sumo wrestling stand as a position, it's harder to be thrown and to be knocked over. The difficulty comes when you have a clash between the cultural dogma, the cultural norm, and the underlying physics, the underlying mathematics of reality. Now remember that culture initially emerges out of the underlying physics, and it is convergent, meaning the culture that survives has anxiety and future think in a 3-foot snow winter. And one teaches one's children, yes, go and enjoy your playing games, but we have to prepare for winter. No, you don't just enjoy yourself, prepare for winter. And so you have in any cyclical environment, there is a very narrow point in the cycle. And the question is, do you make it through? In venture capital, it's with startup paradigms. It's all about, can you reach cash flow neutral, cash flow positive before your venture capital burns up? Because if you can't, you become part of the 80-90% statistic of new ventures that will fold, that will go bankrupt. Elon Musk talked about the day just before Christmas, in which SolarCity, Tesla, and SpaceX were all about to go bankrupt. And if this one little thing hadn't closed on the last day, etc., they'd all vanish, because there wasn't enough cash to see them through to the point where they are now, where they're all worth billions and billions of dollars. So they made it through the narrow point, and this is what leads to the adage, cash is king. This is what led Bill Gates to hoard at least 30 to 50 billion dollars in Microsoft's cash to weather various things that might come up along the way. Now, so initially the culture becomes, works and evolves out of the mathematics of the environment. But over time, a culture becomes more self-referential and elongates, exaggerates the success traits. So, for example, if a nomadic culture managed to conquer territory by war, then the nomadic culture develops more warlike characteristics and honors the warrior and the warrioress, which then leads more people aspiring to be warriors and warrioress. Well, what's interesting is they already had the land from winning the first war. And so to move into symmetry and to move into balance, they might now learn about agriculture and architecture and art to develop the land. But what tends to happen is the culture that initially survives a given environment becomes self-referential, and now, rather than enjoying the land that was gained by war, now there is the enjoyment of the war as a symbol of survival that actually gets people killed in the underlying physics of the interaction. Meaning, once you develop a warlike culture, and now you send people off around the world to provoke and win wars, the very thing that initially brought you land now brings you more and more war, which brings you more and more death, which in a certain sense threatens the survival. And what do you do with all that land when you don't have time to develop it because you're off conquering more land that has no meaning for you other than in a scorecard? And it's things like these scorecards that start substituting from the actual physics of well-being and survival. The actual physics of human needs that say every human being first needs to survive, then they need to feel secure in that survival, then they need to have love and belonging. Then they need to develop a sense of self-esteem and appreciation and respect for oneself. Then they need to develop their innate talents and their innate gifts. Then they need to serve the community and develop abundance by sharing those gifts. And then finally, at a certain point in that growth cycle, to transcend the creation and sharing of gifts by thinking beyond the individual ego and remembering the collective into a synergy, a transcendent whole, the individual that remembers its connection with the body of which it is a part. And so when a coping mechanism, a survival practice such as war or thinking about the future or worrying becomes that point. For example, hatred or jealousy can do this. Hatred and jealousy are both focusing energies. And so some people become successful in their jealous seeking of revenge for a given person that slighted them, that did this. And so they become more and more successful. They compete to beat, to win, to have revenge, to dominate. But at a certain point, they've won. that focusing ritual has brought dividends. They've won. But then there's often a fear. You'll hear highly competitive and successful people talking about the fact that they don't want, that it was the desperation that helped them do that. So they're trying to stay hungry is often, how it's referred to. I want to keep that feeling, that drive, even though I'm surrounded by more abundance than I possibly know what to do with. I want to keep holding on to that feeling of scarcity or jealousy or hatred or revenge, because that's what is my focusing technology that helps me, get through the point. So over time, cultures become more and more dissociative from reality and more self-referential. That's why they're cult-like. You can no longer understand why children are studying this in school and at this and doing. You can no longer understand why is that intelligent to do. For example, if you're spending more time prolonging your life than you're spending enjoying your life, why are you prolonging your life if you don't enjoy it? You're just prolonging your suffering, your ordeal. You're prolonging your ordeal of prolonging life, as opposed to actually prolonging a life that's worth living. And so you reach this point of diminishing returns. Similarly with hedonic adaptation, the first bite of chocolate is delicious. The second is very filling and satisfying. The third is great. By the time you're at your 50th spoonful of chocolate, you feel sick. But you have this idea, more is better. This is delicious chocolate, but it's making you sick. So when a culture becomes out of tune with the underlying physics that it initially used to survive, you now have a very difficult choice as a human being between listening to the underlying physics of reality or listening to the culture heuristics that were originally connected with reality but are now dissociative. For example, the same with the relationship with ecology. There was a time when the battle with nature to not get run over by a rhinoceros, to not get killed by a snake, that there was a battle. And then we fortified and had more things and killed more of nature and turned it into more things, and then killed some more nature and killed more things, till eventually what threatens us as a species today is not nature, but the fact that we've killed so much nature so efficiently that the host body upon which our species resides is killing the source of oxygen and polluting the oxygen faster than it's making oxygen, etc., so that we're now, the efficiency of destroying nature is now one of the single greatest threats to our species, whereas before we didn't have the efficiency to transform nature into comfortable, safe habitat enough. Now we have it too much. And we're still wrestling with that point where the culture says get a bigger house. You're more important if you have a bigger house. The culture says you're more important if you have 3 cars. The culture says you're more important if you have 50 suits rather than just 1 pair of clothes. The culture is saying more and more and more, but the science is saying less, less, less. It's gone past the pendulum point. And so if you have to pick a position based on the underlying mathematics of reality or based on the cult-like absurdities of your culture, as a general rule, particularly if you're dealing with things, you want to pick mathematics. Because the cult needs to keep evolving into a living culture by sustaining its relationship with mathematics, not by dissociating from the underlying reality. But many of our young people and old people alike have to decide between things such as what is actually mathematically intelligent because it produces more human well-being per unit of energy invested, but is culturally atypical, culturally anomalous, such that the culture attacks and punishes that which is most intelligent. And in this dynamic, it is the culture that has moved into a weak position and become a waning culture. The weaker the position of the culture, the less the culture can be supported by the underlying physics of reality, the more the culture will move into decline. And we know this, of course, because there have been 10,000 cultures, 10,000 languages in human history. Well, where are they all now? Well, most of them are dead. Most of the 10,000 languages, there are now less than 600 living languages in the world. And they're dying at a rate of up to about up to one every 2 weeks. The last person who spoke that language is dying. So if we're in a dynamic in which the vast majority, more than 90% of all languages and all cultures are dead, the reason they died is not because they were superior to the present cultures, but because the present cultures were superior at meeting human needs for survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, development, it gives, etc., than the cultures before. And a lot of it pivots on survival. Because, for example, if a tribe doesn't learn anything about global medicine and viruses and this and that and the other, and a few American journalists penetrate the tribe and bring with them bacteria and diseases that the tribe never had to fight before, the tribe is wiped out. There may have only been 200 people, 1,000 people in that tribe. It's wiped out by a single outflow of chickenpox, etc. Whereas the culture that has focused a lot on epidemiology, etc., such as ourselves, when those tribes bring a new virus in, we go into action to protect the culture. It's still an interesting time and an interesting place in which our culture is the biggest threat to human survival. But while we're going full tilt in the decimation of other cultures, etc., it appears like a very strong culture. Now, when assessing positions, you want to look at as many dimensions as possible because, for example, let's say we're looking at this situation right here. And let's say it's flat, meaning if we look at it from the side, it looks like this. Now, there's lots of bits back here, but it has no width. Then if the wind shifts this way, it'll fall over. So a teepee-like shape is much stronger than, for example, and this is why you need breadth of dimension. For example, something that makes very good money but kills the soul is not as strong as a position as something that feeds the soul, feeds the heart, feeds the bank, produces actually useful objects, and you have a lot more strength. And so ultimately, intelligence, human intelligence, is opening and partnering with reality to create stronger and stronger relationships that are more and more sustainable with the data available. This is a strong position.